my experience as far as reviewing pitches is probably in the hundreds, if not thousands, right? And I think there's a skill set that entrepreneurs need to develop when it comes to pitching their story. I always urge or recommend to entrepreneurs just to make sure that you have a very clear story. I think at the end of the day, capital providers, whether it's venture capitalists or whether it's strategics or debt providers, kind of all the different worlds there, are typically looking for a similar framework of things. And so I think that's a relatively basic skill, but it is a skill that hopefully can be honed in over time. I think some of the more critical errors, as I think about it, is not having a full grasp of what are the 1 to 2 or 3 things that are going to make or break your company.
And now, from San Francisco and the UCSF Rosenman Institute, the Health Technology Podcast with your host, Christine Winoto.
On every startup founder's mind is the question, what do investors want to hear? Our guest today, Amrinder Singh, knows all about that. But his advice is not exactly to guess what investors want. Amrinder is currently a principal at Vensana Capital, and he has a lot of experience in the industry. Prior to Vensana, he was a senior investment director at Medtronic Ventures and also led their business development and strategy. All this means he's very knowledgeable about the questions startups want answered. And today, I asked them all. Here's our conversation. Well, thank you, Amrinder, for joining me this morning.
Thanks, Christine. It's a pleasure.
And so you are sitting in Minneapolis, but you used to be in California. Tell me what's your background, where you started, like how you end up working in medical devices and now here at Vensana.
Yeah, no, thanks again for having me, and really appreciate the work that you do with the podcast. I think I've had a bit of a nonlinear path from a career perspective. I started my career I started as an engineer actually at Thortec, which is a company in the heart failure space. And so we developed heart pumps essentially that were meant to work for potentially the remainder of a person's life. And these are typically very sick patients. And so, they don't have a whole lot of options. And that was intriguing to me. And I think I think back to kind of what started me into that career path was, I vividly remember kind of these technologies quite literally changing the trajectory of disease for these patient populations. And that initially was the hook, right? I think it was that and the fact that they were willing to hire me, right? So I think that was probably number one. And then number two was, just the mission and everything else that the company had, I thought was incredibly impressive. And, just to be able to do that with machinery, technologies, and medicine, and, was I thought incredibly impressive. Mm-hmm. And, from there, I ended up moving towards kind of after my engineering role to a product management role. And that was, I think for me, kind of one big change career-wise, because I had initially thought that I could be an engineer for the next 20, 30, 40 plus years. My parents come from kind of a technical background, and I just assumed that would be the right path for me as well. And then, shifting to product management, I think was really my first entree into business, really understanding how to think about launching a product and what customers want and, all these different things that I think coming from a background where you're heavily focused on, math and science, and you don't really think too much about the business aspects of a company. It was a great initial education into the role. And then, from there, I ended up going to business school and ended up joining Medtronic in a corporate strategy role. And I would say it was at Medtronic where I really got the formal education and application into business. It was there that I really began to understand kind of different businesses and started to enjoy breaking them down, putting them together, kind of recognizing what led to creating value for not just kind of our patients and our clinical community, but also for a large corporation. And after that corporate strategy stint, I spent, I'd say, the next 4 to 5 years really diving into the world of what at Medtronic we were calling at the time value-based healthcare. And I think we've talked about, I know Medtronic has talked about this before. And it's just really understanding, the general business of healthcare, right? Really understanding incentives, healthcare policy, payers, providers. I ended up leading our M&A and strategy team within this domain at Medtronic. And, it was a fun period of time. Lots of learnings, looking at companies that were very different than what Medtronic was used to looking at, whether they were services companies or software-based companies. And I'd say, I learned a lot. There's probably some goods and bads and failures along the way, puts and starts, I would put it. But I started having an itch to really get back into the technology and kind of product focus that I had started my career. And that's what eventually led to a job. It was a newly created effort actually within Medtronic to have a venture capital function. And that was another transformative ramp for me personally. It was an opportunity to understand, how the world of venture capital works, how to think deeply about researching new spaces and companies, developing theses, funding select companies per year, and then underwriting risk, right? And managing that portfolio over time. And so, that was about a 4 or 5 year journey at Medtronic as well. I'd say it was all those different experiences, both combined with Thorotech and at Medtronic, really learning about core technologies, learning about value-based healthcare, as I was describing, kind of really trying to understand how to steer the ship in that direction, understanding different stakeholders, how different products, whether they're software-based or hardware, kind of typical devices, kind of all of that work led me to where I am today, which is at Vensana Capital, which I can talk about as well.
Yeah. So before we dive in more about your work at Vensana, what caught my thinking about is the value-based care.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's a lot more toward that direction. And I think sometimes being in medical devices, like how do you make that transition or path to get to embrace the whole value-based care? Like you have that experience a lot in Medtronic. Can you share with us some of the things that you learned and some of the mistakes that you made?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and I wish I had a perfect answer here, right? But I think it was an interesting evolution for Medtronic. Just thinking back to kind of where it started from. A lot of the work originated out of Europe. In fact, I ended up spending a year there while I was at Medtronic to really kind of learn where the genesis really happened. And the way it worked was a lot of the kind of our commercial sales force in Medtronic Europe started managing cath labs and other departments while we were out there, and we just had so much product running through these different departments. And eventually the department heads at these, whether it was cath labs or, ORs, really started asking for help in managing, maybe initially things like inventory, and over time, kind of just overall workflows, how to just be more efficient. And that started leading to, how do we ensure better outcomes in these patients' clinical outcomes as well? So there was always this kind of economic efficiency bent to it. But it eventually started shifting more towards a clinical bent as well. And I think that was really the trigger that started this business for Medtronic. And I thought Medtronic was in a unique place, right? We were considered a very trusted partner with some of these different institutions. And that started lending itself to different areas across Medtronic. I think there was a lot of interest, really from the top, from our CEO and other leaders at Medtronic to think, how do we apply these same principles to other, our businesses today, where we can become more partners with our, I guess, customers, so to speak, right? And, a few different areas that I spent a lot of time on was to think really hard about bundled payments, which was an area that, in my mind at least, made a lot of sense for a medical device company to participate in. I mean, I wrote a white paper, even in fact, I think, on how to think about that and how to manage distinct populations through a certain kind of window or workflow, whether that was 90 days or in some cases even longer, but really being on the hook for the clinical outcomes and the economics for that patients as well. I think additional areas that we looked pretty closely at was how do we take risk with payers, I guess in the U.S. especially. Where we really felt that some of the technologies that we were bringing forth can continue to be paid in the way that they're paid today. But I think what everybody could agree to is the way that things are paid for today may not be how things are paid for 5 years from now or even 20 years from now, right? And so how do we start really dipping our toe into kind of understanding the pain points for our, the payers today? And so, some of that involved, well, why don't we help you manage that risk? Because we felt confident with the technologies that we were bringing to the table. And so whether that was in particular clinical domains like heart failure or diabetes, we had to be pretty thoughtful about what was the operational framework in doing something like that. We weren't, I wouldn't say that we were, experts at taking risk and underwriting risk when it comes to large populations. But, do we need to add service components? Do we need to add administrative capabilities? And I think a lot of that was what I was tasked with how do we take these different visions that we have across the organization and really try to operationalize them within the company?
So at the end, with that in mind about understanding that the payers' interest now versus down the road, did Medtronic do something differently, adding different services? And is that something that you think, it's probably not, like you said, Medtronic's strength, but then is it something that the strength that Medtronic is building, willing to invest and build on it? Or at the end, it's not like, this is not really our thing?
Yeah, no, I think it's a good question, right? And I think there's multiple answers here, right? So if you think about, Medtronic is always great, or any corporate really is graded on multiple different fronts, right? You have your customers and your patients that you're delivering products to, but you also have Wall Street, right? And they're taking a very close look at, are you doing what you're saying? And we're willing to believe, some of your visions or some of the kind of the moonshots that you have, let's say. But over time, if things aren't panning out, you really have to, you start kind of paying Piper from that front. And so I think there was a really concerted effort for a number of years to try to identify different ways to pursue value-based healthcare, right? And I think we started a lot of different pilots. A lot of our businesses, in fact, started thinking very differently, thinking about data and services and kind of some of those other factors. I'm not there anymore, but that has continued, even since I was gone. And I think the company has really been focused, whether it's in the U.S. or even internationally. In some cases, it's easier to do internationally just because the governments and the payment systems there just are more aligned, that you don't have to worry about, if you're able to improve an outcome 3 to 5 years down the road in the U.S. System, that may not be something that, is let's say meets the ROI requirements, right? Maybe that's too technical of a term, but you know exactly what I mean, right? And whereas I feel like in certain other governments, there's just more willingness to understand kind of longitudinal outcomes for patients, whether that's clinical or if you're able to save costs. And so I think there's been continued effort on that front, and I think one of the most intriguing things that Medtronic and other companies are now thinking more and more about is how do you convert, how do you have that conversion between our typical device businesses, but then also with data, digital health services, different types of business models. And I think there's a lot of exploratory work that continues, to this day. And it's actually really driven a lot of kind of how I think about investing in companies that are in that intersection with devices and with data as well.
Right. So which brings me to my next question about Vensana Capital. If you can tell me more about what are the focus areas that Vensana Capital is interested in, and we can start from there.
Yeah, no, that sounds good. So Vensana itself is, it's a firm that we invest essentially in everything outside of biopharma, I would say. I think simply, right? So we invest in devices, we invest in digital health, diagnostics, tools, drug delivery. So pretty much everything in that kind of healthcare ecosystem. And, maybe even just stepping back a little bit, kind of as the philosophy of the firm, it was really founded by these two investors, really, Kirk Nielsen and Justin Klein, who I met during my time at Medtronic. And they've been some of the most successful investors in the medtech ecosystem, kind of investing across that portfolio as I described. And I think, the strategy that they put together really for Vensana was, really to try to be focused and deliberate about how many opportunities we look at each year. I think, on a given year basis, we make a handful of investments, 3 to 5 or 6 new investments per year. And I think that really gives us the time and space to be proactive and thoughtful about where we want to spend our time and our dollars. And, candidly, I feel like, maybe this sounds a little businessy, but it is a bit of a competitive advantage in our field too. Especially in this current time period.
This podcast is sponsored by Brown Rudnick's Global Life Sciences Group, a team of legal professionals that help life science companies, lenders, and investors around the world turn good science into good business. Learn more at brownrudnick.com. This podcast is also sponsored by Canon Quality Group. Canon Quality Group has been helping medtech startups set up quality management systems for over 10 years. If you're unsure when to get started with quality management in your startup, turn to the experts at canonqualitygroup.com.
I'm so glad that you still mentioned about medical devices. As you know, there's not that many investors these days out there for medical devices. And of course, everybody, what's the trend that you see in a lot of the medical devices innovation? And I feel like at the same time, everybody now is trying to put in every AI in the world that they can come up with and put it in the device, slap it there, and then we can look for more funding.
Yeah, no, so I agree with you. What I will say though, I think the last few years have been really fruitful for the device sector, right? I mean, I think a lot of new capital came in. I think the markets overall were very positive to devices. There was a number of companies that were able to IPO. So I do think there's been more capital that's come in. And, candidly, from our perspective, that means that there's, potentially more competition because capital starts becoming a bit of a commodity to a certain degree. I wouldn't say it's, nearly at the level that we see in our kind of digital health portfolio or biopharma, which has always been, almost a magnitude greater as far as investment dollars are concerned. But, I think in my mind, that's good, right? I do think that, the way we kind of think about deals, as I was kind of mentioning, is we tend to be very deliberate and focused. And so, especially when there is so much more capital coming in and compressed timelines, I think the strategy of really spending most of our time, kind of identifying which areas we want to play in, and trying to limit the number of deals that we do, being really deliberate about that, I think allows us to get conviction in spaces and areas, well in advance of financing events. And so I think that's been good. As far as areas and spaces, purely in the device sector, look, I agree. But I also don't think that's a bad thing, right? So I know it's almost a joke to a certain degree to say that, hey, well, we do AI and we do robotics, and here's our valuation, right? But on the flip side, I think when I came into my venture part of my career, let's say 5 or so years ago, so it hasn't been that long, but I think there was a genuine question that I heard while getting coffee or lunch or whatnot with individuals of, where is our next generation of entrepreneurs going to come from, right? I think this has been an industry that's been rooted over the last 50, 60, 70 plus years. And I think we have some incredible entrepreneurs who've really been able to develop incredible technologies. But there was always that question that, digital health or biotech or, folks are going into just pure tech or different areas, and kind of where is medtech going to be or devices more specifically going to be. So in my mind, having this convergence, I think is great for the industry. Mm-hmm. I think you're really seeing a lot of younger entrepreneurs who want to do meaningful work and realize that, they don't want to be a doctor or they don't want to go into, working in a lab or something like that, that they're really seeing that you can take devices, whether it's devices that, look and feel more like software or devices that have software components, but with hardware, with physical devices as well that, in their minds can really make a difference. So I'm pretty bullish about that. And I think it's been good for the ecosystem.
Yeah, no, I think I feel like nowadays there's still a lot of challenges in healthcare that you have to be more creative in how to solve the problem. And I think you need more collaboration in different areas. I think, perfect example, company like Kala Health, for example, that has somebody who understands devices, but understands neuroscience. I feel like there's a lot more of that. I think that's an exciting time to be in that technology space that's trying to help people. I don't know if you can share with us a couple of the companies that you're excited about from that you've seen at Vensana or the time that you were at Medtronic before you joined Vensana.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So one of the companies that is in our portfolio that, I think a lot of us are quite excited about is Clearly Health. It's a diagnostic platform built really on CTs, with an AI engine actually, but to really help characterize disease and better treat that patient population. So, in my mind, as I think about digital health investments, it really fits the bill
Mhm.
of what we tend to look for, which I know it's not a perfect framework, but what I would say is, having a team or a leader who really has, I think, having clinical roots, such as the CEO in that company example, really has, I think is phenomenal because they could really understand and speak the language of kind of the ecosystem today, the clinical leadership, whether it's to do studies or whether it's for penetration down the road when the company's commercial. But also, I don't think that those types of companies are afraid of generating really rigorous clinical evidence. And, just given our device backgrounds, I feel like that's an area that we have a lot of comfort in, and we like to see those kinds of companies as well. So anyway, I'd say that's one company. Other companies, that we've looked at or that are in our portfolio, I would say, we have things in the cardiac space, whether that's CVRX that's really looking to tackle heart failure, or companies like Relievant, which is looking at pain, and kind of having different interventional models for treating things like that. What I'll be the first to say though, I've been at Vensana for 7 months now, so my hope is really how do we find more of these types of companies, especially as we get into kind of our second fund here this year.
So having done corporate venture capital versus non-corporate, I know that it's still early for you at Vensana, but I'm sure you've seen the difference already. And as a startup, is that how you approach them should be different, or do you think there's a lot of similarities?
Yeah, I think it's a fair question. I'd say there's probably more similarities than differences, especially with the corporate VC firms that have stood the test of time. I think there are a number of corporate VC firms that kind of come in and out, right, when times are good. And maybe there's an interest at the top. Hey, we should go find new companies, new technologies out there. But then when times are bad, that program shuts down. I think those are probably less favorable for the overall ecosystem. But you do have corporate VCs that have really been there for a long time. It's a commitment from kind of the leadership to not only help generate returns for the mothership, but also to go find these exciting technologies that might be that are strategic to that organization. So in my mind, I'd say there's generally more similarities. I'd say out of the differences, the one nice thing at an institutional VC such as Vensana is this is really the business at Vensana is we're making investments. We're trying to be very thoughtful about where we spend our time, where we make investments, and then how we help our portfolio companies really succeed. At a corporate, as you can imagine, there's 10 or 20 different stakeholders and different customers, so to speak, internally. And venture capital is not the core business of a corporate, obviously. And so to me, that's really the fundamental difference. But at the end of the day, it really comes down to is the person that you're dealing with at the VC, whether it's at the corporate or an institutional VC, really somebody that you feel is going to be value add to yourself as the entrepreneur and to your management team. And I feel like that's probably the most important thing. And I feel like I've been pretty lucky from that standpoint because even during my time at Medtronic, I thought we had a phenomenal team. We had a 6-person team, and I think everybody was sort of had their heart in the right place as to what was important at the end of the day. And I would echo that here at Vensana. It was a big part of kind of selecting to come here.
Having the experience in the value-based care, in how do you see as a startup to think about how to incorporate that thinking? Because I don't think it's going away in the US.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a good question. I think it depends, right? So if you have a breakthrough technological innovation and you're really going after an unmet need that you have a really strong clinical value proposition, whether it's with your, let's say, device, you may be able to not think too heavily about value. You may not have to, right, for the near term, because what you're doing is going to change standard of care because of your breakthrough innovation, and hopefully you can build out the clinical evidence and go through the regulatory pathways, get reimbursement, et cetera, and you can have a viable product and company. On the flip side, if you have a product that really relies on the mechanisms of payment today, the reimbursement mechanisms of payment today, or maybe they don't exist today, I think those companies have to be incredibly mindful about how they think about not only the clinical value proposition, but also the economic value proposition. And is there a viable business model that hopefully makes sense in both worlds, right? In the fee-for-service world, because that's still how the majority of transactions are happening today, but also with a line of sight to the value-based world. And I think that's hard for companies to balance both. But I think the companies that, in my mind, have been successful have been able to succeed in both. And as the world transitions over to more value-based care, I think those kinds of companies, will probably be the best prepared to make that transition.
Do you have any good example that you think companies that has been successful?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, this is probably a category that I've spent some time here looking at, especially during my time at Medtronic, but has gotten a lot of interest. So if you think about primary care redesign and all the different companies that have come in that space, and I think there's a host of statistics and data that someone can rattle off about how much if you can shift the trajectory of a patient and really start with primary care to help manage that trajectory, that you can hopefully, not only improve clinical outcomes, but also, dramatically reduce costs for that patient. But the majority of primary care, as we all know, is functions under a fee-for-service world. And I think if you look at some of the companies that have been more successful, some of them have really started shifting to a risk-based model over the last, I'd say, 5 years. A few companies that we spent a great deal of time on, things like Landmark Health or Iora Medical, and some other companies of that vein. I thought what they did really well was they identified very specifically which population was in their care model and which population they were not going to worry about. And you see it in the renal side as well. Actually, a few companies in that space. And I think those companies have done a really great job. And I think time will tell, right, as far as will they be successful long term? Because some of these companies, although I think from a VC standpoint, or they're in the headlines quite a bit, but they may only manage 5,000, 10,000, 20,000, 50,000 patients. And you have, hopefully a ways to get to 1 million patients or more, right? So I think that's going to be the key test for these companies is, I think they've done the initial right things to transition in both, or to operate in both worlds. But I think timing is hard, right? And really understanding when the world flips to value-based healthcare, I think you got to be ready, right?
Yeah. So look at what happened to COVID, and then it just gives different trajectory for different part of the industry.
Yeah.
So I know we're running out of time, but I want to maybe ask you one last question. You've seen a lot of company presentation pitches. You meet a lot of entrepreneurs. What are the mistakes that you've seen that you can share with others so that they can avoid? And there's also another question: what mistake that entrepreneurs need to go through in order to be able to become a better entrepreneur?
Yeah, those are great questions, right? And I agree. So my experience as far as reviewing pitches is probably in the hundreds, if not thousands, right? And I think there's a skill set that entrepreneurs need to develop when it comes to pitching their story. And, I don't think these are big mistakes, because generally speaking, these entrepreneurs are probably some of the best individuals in the world at attacking the problem that they're going after. What, they may have incredible expertise or domain expertise, whether it's clinical or technical or something else. And a pitch deck is a pitch deck at the end of the day, right? And I always urge or recommend to entrepreneurs just to make sure that you have a very clear story. I think at the end of the day, capital providers, whether it's venture capitalists or whether it's strategics or debt providers, kind of all the different worlds there, are typically looking for a similar framework of things. And so I think that's a relatively basic skill, but it is a skill that hopefully can be honed in over time. I think some of the more critical errors, as I think about it, is not having a full grasp of what are the 1 to 2 or 3 things that are going to make or break, your company, right? And in some cases, that could be reimbursement. And if we're starting to dig into reimbursement, for example, on a device company that there's no code or no reimbursement paradigm that exists today, and that team hasn't really spent a whole lot of time thinking about that element, and they've really spent all of their time thinking about the product features that their product has and why that's better than the other products out there. I feel like things like that are, in my mind, a bit of a red flag, just because you want to make sure that you're really honing in on what are going to be the key risks that stand in the way of really creating value for the company, the patients, the shareholders, everybody else. I would say that's probably the biggest watch out in my mind is really being thoughtful about how do you define success in the next 3, 5, 10 years for a particular company, and how do you ensure that you're focused on those few things, especially when you're doing a pitch, but absolutely as you're running your business.
Mm-hmm. So I was about to ask you my follow-up question, but I'm running out of time.
No problem.
But there's so many different investors out there, and sure. I guess what I'm asking, like, what is the right way of defining success? That has to be realistic. That has to be achievable. There's a path to get there, or defining success that align with the investors.
Yeah. And look, to your point, right? I think there's a lot of different ways to define it, right? And I think it depends on the lens that you want to look at. From an investor standpoint, I'd say what we tend to look for is, what is going to get this company over the next, let's say, 3 to 5, 3 to 7 year horizon to a place where hopefully that there's an exit opportunity there, right? And exits generally happen, whether that's a strategic or a corporate that becomes really interested, or whether they have the ability to go IPO. That's generally based off, a few factors, right? Is there strong clinical evidence that the company has started to generate or has generated that really shows that there's that value proposition that is going to really shift clinical decision making, right? I think the hope for most of these technologies is to really redefine how care is delivered for that population. So I think that's one element that generally companies need to be pretty thoughtful of. I think another element, is really managing the regulatory pathway. I think the FDA has done a phenomenal job over the last I'd say 5 to 10 years of trying to be pretty clear about what is required to get your product to market. And, that's another underpinning of what typically tends to define success and can lead to exits for these companies. And then I think lastly is there a business model that kind of underpins the whole thing, and whether it's under the confines of the fee-for-service model today, with typical reimbursement that many of these companies have to go through, which has been a challenge for a lot of companies in the last few years. We've seen a lot of companies that have taken longer to get to that kind of value creation or success point, just because that's taken 2, 3, 4 years longer than one expects, right? And so I think that would be kind of a key element as well. Once again, whether that's part of today's fee-for-service world, or whether there's different kind of innovative business models that company's thinking. But I think being thoughtful about that is important too. So, it's a broad question, but I think from an investor standpoint, I think those are the things that we tend to think about, how you define success for a company. And, of course, it's going to be different from every other stakeholder's perspective.
Well, that's great. Well, thank you for sharing that.
No, of course.
Thanks for your time.
Thank you, Christine. Appreciate it once again.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Health Technology Podcast. We want to thank our executive producer, Herminio Neto, and our podcast engineer, Andrew Rojek. If you enjoyed this podcast, be sure to subscribe and leave a review. The Health Technology Podcast is available on all major platforms.